When a black passenger faces racism at 35,000 feet, an emergency changes everything. When Jermain Sinclair first boarded the plane, he was just another passenger looking forward to a routine flight. A tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s, Jermain exuded calm confidence. Little did he know that this journey would test his character in ways far beyond the normal challenges of travel. As he settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't ignore the cold, scrutinizing stares from the flight crew. Sarah, one of the flight attendants, stood out with her dismissive attitude, making it clear that his presence was unwelcome. Jermain took a breath, steadying himself. He had been through this before, the subtle and not-so-subtle racism that came from people making assumptions based on his appearance. At first, it seemed like mild indifference, but as the minutes passed, Sarah's behavior escalated into outright disrespect. When she checked his boarding pass, there was a noticeable pause before she handed it back, as if she couldn't quite believe that he belonged in first class. "I guess they're letting anyone fly first class these days," she muttered under her breath as he walked past, her voice laced with disdain. Jermain heard her clearly, but kept walking, choosing to ignore the comment. He had learned long ago that engaging with every ignorant remark would only exhaust him. Jermain found his seat, stowed his leather carry-on bag, and sat down, trying to shake off the unease that Sarah had caused. He had spent years working hard to get to where he was, a respected commercial pilot with over a decade of experience. Despite his accomplishments, there were always people like Sarah, quick to judge him by the color of his skin rather than his credentials or skills. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah's behavior grew increasingly difficult to overlook. She interacted with the other passengers in first class with warmth and courtesy, offering them drinks, snacks, and smiles. But when she reached Jermain's seat, her tone changed. "What do you want to drink?" she asked curtly, barely looking at him. "Water, please," Jermain responded, keeping his voice calm. Sarah placed the plastic cup of water on his tray table with such force that some of the water splashed over the rim. Without even acknowledging him, she moved on to the next passenger. Jermain clenched his jaw but said nothing. He wasn't going to let her get to him, though her behavior was becoming increasingly blatant. Other passengers began to take notice. An elderly couple a few rows back exchanged glances, whispering to each other about what they had just witnessed. A young businessman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly aware of Sarah's treatment of Jermain, but unwilling to say anything. As the flight progressed, Jermain tried to relax, but the tension was palpable. Sarah's disdainful glances in his direction, her clipped tone, and the way she continued to treat him like an inconvenience weighed on him. He had faced discrimination throughout his career, both as a black man and as a pilot, but there was something about this encounter that stung deeper than usual. Maybe it was because he wasn't here as a pilot today. He was simply a passenger, and even then, he couldn't escape the assumptions people made about him. Then came a moment that changed everything. The plane suddenly jolted, caught in a wave of turbulence that was more violent than usual. Passengers gasped as the aircraft shook. Jermain's instincts kicked in immediately. This wasn't normal turbulence. He had flown enough to recognize the difference. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, strained and shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some difficulties in the cockpit. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement did little to calm the growing anxiety in the cabin. Whispers spread through the passengers, and Jermain could feel the fear rising around him. He glanced toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendants had gathered, their faces pale. He overheard bits of their conversation. "The pilot's collapsed. The co-pilot is overwhelmed. We don't know what to do." Jermain's pulse quickened, but not from fear. This was the kind of situation he had trained for, an emergency in the air. Without hesitation, he stood up and made his way toward the flight attendants, catching the attention of Sarah and her colleagues. "Excuse me," Jermain said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a commercial pilot. I can help." Sarah looked at him, her disbelief evident. "You?" she scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I don't think this is the time for—" "Listen," Jermain interrupted, his voice steady and authoritative. "I've been flying commercial planes for over 12 years. If you don't let me help, we're all in trouble." Her face flushed as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Another flight attendant, Alex, who had been watching the exchange, quickly stepped in. "We need to get him to the cockpit," Alex said, ignoring Sarah's hesitation. He grabbed the intercom and relayed Jermain's offer to the co-pilot. Within seconds, the co-pilot's panicked voice crackled through the speaker. "Please, send him in." Jermain moved swiftly toward the cockpit, Alex by his side. The passengers, who had been murmuring anxiously, quieted as they watched him walk past, some of them throwing hopeful glances in his direction. As the cockpit door opened, Jermain was greeted by chaos. The captain was unconscious in his seat, and the young co-pilot was struggling to manage both the controls and the overwhelming turbulence. The instrument panel was lit up with warning signals, and the co-pilot's hands shook as he tried to steady the plane. "Thank God you're here," the co-pilot gasped as Jermain entered. I don't know what's happening." Jermain quickly assessed the situation. "Let's stabilize the plane first," he said, taking the co-pilot's place at the controls. His hands moved swiftly and confidently over the instrument panel as he adjusted the heading and altitude, guiding the aircraft out of the turbulent air pocket. Gradually, the plane began to level out, the shuddering decreasing as Jermain's experience and calm took over. The co-pilot watched in awe as Jermain expertly handled the aircraft, communicating with air traffic control to coordinate an emergency landing. "We'll be making an emergency landing at Newark Liberty International," Jermain said, his voice steady as he relayed the information to the co-pilot. "We've got enough fuel, and the weather conditions look stable. Let's just keep things smooth until we're cleared to land." Back in the cabin, the passengers sat in tense silence. The whispers had died down, replaced by the quiet buzz of nervous anticipation. They knew something was wrong, but most were still unaware of the full scope of the situation. As the plane steadied, Sarah, who had been anxiously pacing in the galley, finally began to understand the gravity of what Jermain had done. Her earlier dismissiveness and prejudice were now replaced by a sense of dawning realization and shame. The elderly woman who had noticed Sarah's behavior earlier nudged her husband. "That man just saved our lives," she whispered, her voice filled with both gratitude and disbelief. "And she treated him like he didn't belong here." As the plane descended toward Newark, the cabin crew prepared for an emergency landing. Alex moved up and down the aisle, explaining the procedures to the passengers while Sarah stood off to the side, visibly shaken by the turn of events. She caught glimpses of Jermain in the cockpit through the slightly open door and knew she had misjudged him, terribly. The landing was as smooth as it could be under the circumstances. As the wheels touched down on the runway, a wave of relief washed over the passengers, and a loud cheer erupted throughout the cabin. Jermain, who had kept his cool the entire time, allowed himself a small sigh of relief as he guided the plane to a stop. Emergency vehicles quickly surrounded the aircraft, and paramedics rushed to the cockpit to attend to the unconscious captain. The co-pilot, still visibly shaken, turned to Jermain with a look of pure gratitude. "I can't thank you enough," he said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Jermain gave him a nod, modest as always. "You would have figured it out," he replied, though he knew that time had been of the essence. As they completed the shutdown procedures, the cabin door opened, and the passengers began to disembark. Many stopped to thank Jermain personally, shaking his hand and expressing their heartfelt gratitude. Some even apologized for not standing up earlier when they had noticed Sarah's behavior. Sarah herself approached Jermain, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty and guilt. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her eyes downcast. "I was wrong about you. I made assumptions and I treated you horribly. If it weren't for you..." Jermain looked at her, his expression calm but firm. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about how you treat people in general. What you did today, that's not just wrong, it's dangerous. You never know who someone is or what they're capable of." Sarah nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment and regret. "I'll do better," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." As Jermain exited the plane, he was met by David Martinez, a senior operations manager from the airline. "Mr. Johnson," Martinez began, shaking Jermain's hand vigorously. "You've just saved the lives of everyone on board, and on behalf of the airline, I want to extend our deepest thanks. We owe you a great deal." Jermain, ever humble, smiled politely. "I'm just glad I could help." But as they spoke, the murmurs of discontent surrounding Sarah's behavior grew louder. Several passengers had filmed parts of the flight, including her earlier comments and actions toward Jermain. By the time Jermain reached the terminal, the video had gone viral on social media. People were outraged at the blatant racism Jermain had faced, especially given his heroism during the emergency. The airline wasted no time in responding. Martinez, looking uncomfortable, addressed the issue head-on. "We are conducting an internal investigation into the conduct of our flight attendants, particularly Sarah. Discrimination in any form is unacceptable, and we will ensure appropriate action is taken." Jermain watched the unfolding situation with mixed feelings. He didn't want to see anyone lose their job, but he knew that people like Sarah needed to be held accountable for their actions. More importantly, he hoped that this incident would lead to a broader conversation about racism and the treatment of Black people in professional spaces. In the days that followed, Jermain was approached by the airline with an offer to take on a role as a senior pilot and diversity consultant, helping them to reform their policies and training programs. After careful consideration, Jermain accepted the position, seeing it as an opportunity to mentor young pilots from underrepresented backgrounds and to push for meaningful changes within the industry. Months passed, and the airline began implementing new diversity initiatives, thanks to Jermain's guidance. He split his time between flying and working on projects designed to foster inclusivity and address systemic bias within the company. His actions on that fateful flight had sparked a movement not just within the airline, but across the industry. One day, as Jermain prepared for another flight, Alex, the young flight attendant who had been kind to him during the emergency, approached him. "Captain Johnson," Alex said, smiling, "I just wanted to thank you. After what happened, I realized how important it is to speak up when something's wrong. I've been more vocal when I see discrimination now." Jermain smiled, proud of Alex's growth. "That's how change starts," he said. "One person at a time, one action at a time." As Jermain settled into the cockpit, ready for takeoff, he reflected on how much had changed since that day. His actions had not only saved lives, but had also helped break down barriers of prejudice, one flight at a time. The world wasn't perfect, but with people like Alex stepping up and conversations around racism finally happening, Jermain knew they were heading in the right direction. As the plane lifted off into the clear blue sky, Jermain glanced out the window, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment. He wasn't just flying planes, he was helping shape the future, one where people would be judged by their abilities, not by their appearance. And for him, that was the most important journey of all. What would you have done if you were one of the passengers on Jermain's flight? Let us know in the comments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support fuels my passion to keep sharing these meaningful stories, and I'm so thankful to have you on this journey.